Andrew Jackson had a long history with the Native Americans. When President Adams was during his presidency, Jackson was actually sent into Florida to stop the first Seminole uprising that was going on there with the Seminoles that were starting to resist invasion and settling by the Americans. And so Jackson was sent in what was known as the First Seminole War to try and stop this conflict that was going on. So when Jackson became president, he and Vice President Calhoun believed that as the country began to increase, as more people began to settle into Indian territory, they felt that the best course of action was actually Indian removal. That in order to avoid further conflict, it would be best if the Native Americans would be moved to another part of the country, since areas along the southeast were now more wanted because of the fact that they wanted to expand farmland and more American settlers were moving into these regions. So Jackson then created what was known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs in order to deal with the Indian removal. Now, in the Southeast, there were five large tribes that lived there. They were the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole, and the Chickasaw. Right? They were known as the civilized tribes because a lot of these tribes figured that in order to avoid conflict with the American settlers, many of these tribes began to adopt a lot of American kind of cultural traits, or what we would call today assimilation, right? They try to be part of the overall main culture. They felt if they did that, then it would avoid conflict and maybe the American government and settlers would leave them alone. Now, the Choctaw and the Creek were among the first groups to start to be sent into Indian Territory, which was at this point located in what was known as Oklahoma Territory. It was on the outskirts past the Mississippi River, where this land really wasn't something that was valued by the Americans because it was kind of dry and not really great. So that's the land that they decided to move the Indians onto. So these Choctaw and Creek were actually the first groups that they started to move into this territory. Now, on this journey, which was very long, it was cold, there wasn't really enough supplies to provide for these people as they moved. About 25% of the Choctaw died during the travel from cold, disease, and starvation. And because of that, other Indian nations that saw what happened to them began to resist removal because they saw what the hardship was, and they began to resist the removal from their territories into Oklahoma. The Cherokee were one of these groups that were part of these civilized tribes, and they thought that perhaps they would be able to resist removal from the territories. They were most of the time left alone until gold was found on their land. And because of that, then they began to be removed from these territories. So the Cherokee actually decided to take their case all the way to the court in a case that was known as Worcester versus Georgia, right, in which the Cherokee were recognized as an independent nation and that they could not be removed from their territory. However, this wasn't really something that was enforced, even though that was the passing of the court. There was an enforcement of this along Georgia. So the people within Georgia and the military and the militia within Georgia actually continued their removal of the Cherokee from their home to Oklahoma. And that's why this particular movement from the Native Americans to this Oklahoma territory is known as the Trail of Tears, right? Because of the brutality of the trip itself, and also the fact that a lot of these Native Americans were moved forcefully and really without any consent and right to these new reservations, forcing them to leave their homes that they have been living there for generations and generations. In Florida, right, the Seminoles continued to resist removal, and this time under the leadership of a very well-known Seminole chief, which was Osceola. He urged all of his people to go to war against the Americans and resist their displacement. And so this was known as the Second Seminole War. A lot of these Native Americans continued to fight against the American military that was coming into Florida to try and take them out. Many of the military forces used tactics that today probably would not seem right, as the fact that under kind of mistrust of truce. They pretended to have a truce to bring in the leaders in order to talk with them. However, once the leaders came to talk with them in this a sign of truce, they actually took them and took them prisoner. And many of their leaders, along with Osceola, died because of these tricks. So it really was kind of a dark time in American history when we kind of think of what happened during the Trail of Tears and these Seminole Wars. It was not really our best moments during this time. The Seminoles are going to continue to resist. And actually, when we take a look and when we think about the Seminoles, they really were the one major tribe that the Americans were not really fully able to ever conquer. And eventually, the government is going to tell the military to abandon what was going on in Florida and kind of leave them be. And the Seminoles are really the only tribe where the US government was not really able to take over. And so that's why the Seminole tribes, you still see how generations of the Seminole tribes still have remained in Florida, because they were never really able to be displaced from here and moved into Oklahoma. Not a large, only portions of them, not all of them. So this is what occurred during Jackson and his Indian removal. And this is why a lot of controversy has come across with Jackson of whether his presidency was a legacy that was positive or negative. There's a lot of good and bad that happened within the presidency of Jackson and kind of his overall beliefs of what to do in the country and the different people within the country. But that's something that I'll leave up to you to make your own decisions.